Hey guys, thanks for joining us. This is our second episode of our Discipleship podcast where we consider what the Bible has to say about current issues. And I hope that all of you had an opportunity to listen to the podcast from Do Justice with Steve Allred entitled, Who Cares About the Undocumented? And so what I'll be doing is just sharing my perspectives and my thoughts about the subject of immigration and foreigners and the undocumented, and what I liked from the podcast, what I didn't like from the podcast, what I learned from the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it as well. But before we continue, let's have a word of prayer. Father God, I just thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. And as we consider the subject of illegal immigration, the undocumented, I pray that you may show us what you have to say about the foreigner and about the immigrant. And not just show us what you have to say about it, but show us probably how we should be thinking about it and how we should be responding to it as well. Guide us and lead us in this discussion. We pray for clarity and for understanding, and we ask for your Spirit to be present. In Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen. All right, so again, as I said, we'll be discussing the podcast episode entitled, Who Cares About the Undocumented? I hope you had a chance to listen to it. If not, I'll still put a description of it or a link for it in the description here at the bottom. So before we begin, there's a few Bible verses that I'd like us to consider just to kind of establish the framework of where we're coming from. So there is Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 17. Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 17. And the Bible here says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the foreigner, take up the cause of the orphan, and plead the case of the widow. So here in this biblical passage, we're presented with three groups of individuals. We're presented with the foreigner and the oppressed, with the orphan, and with the widow. And these three groups come up consistently in the Old Testament writings as a protected group, as a group that God especially protects and calls us to protect as well. What I also find interesting about this verse is kind of the legal language that it uses in respect to these individuals. For example, it says, plead the case of the widow, or take up the cause of the orphan, or defend the foreigner. So again, God is calling us more than to just have sympathy for these individuals, but he's actually calling us to action on these individuals. Here's the second verse. Exodus chapter 22 and verse 21. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow and the orphan. And if you do, and they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. Again, you have these three groups of the foreigners, the widow, and the orphan. And God tells us, don't mistreat or oppress the foreigner. Do not take advantage of widows and orphans. And if they cry out to me, I will hear their cry, and I will do something about it. So that's pretty serious language. But I think it gets even more serious in this third verse, which is found in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 34. And here the Bible says, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Wow, just pause there and think about that one. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. And I find it interesting that especially these two passages in Exodus and Leviticus, they are found in the Torah, in the book of law that should have guided Israel in ancient days. And here God is saying, treat the foreigner as a native born, and don't just treat him like a native born, but love him, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. I just think these are three very powerful Bible verses that I think can help frame our discussion when we talk about immigration and the undocumented. All right, so now jumping into the podcast. So the podcast guest was Fabian Carballo, and he gets right into it. And one of the things that he says early on is that the United States has toppled governments in Latin America for the sole reason of controlling their economy and controlling the region. And as I heard that, I am Hispanic. My dad is from Colombia, South America, and my mother is from Honduras, in Central America. And I was born here in the United States of America. They were first generation immigrants to this country. And so when I hear a fellow Hispanic make a statement like this, that the United States has toppled governments in Latin America for the sole reason of controlling their economy and region, that's a tough one. That's a tough one for me. There's going to be a tweet that I'll link here at the bottom, a tweet that I came across a few months back, and it shows a map. And the title of the map says U.S.-backed coups in Latin America. And they show the countries, and they highlight in red all the countries where the U.S. has backed military coups. And it's pretty much every country in Latin America. And so, man, that's a really tough statement. I personally have mixed feelings about U.S. foreign policy. I get that the U.S. Should look out for its own interests in foreign affairs, but sometimes the best interest of the United States comes in or is at odds with the best interest of the foreign countries that it's engaged in. And so I have very mixed feelings about that because I'm a citizen of this country and I consider myself an American. And I get it, I want the U.S. to prosper. I want the U.S. to be a great nation. If the U.S. is a great nation, that means everybody else here in the U.S. will be able to participate in that greatness. But sometimes what's good for us comes at the expense of another country. And in fact, sometimes what's best for us can have detrimental effects on the citizens of other countries. And so that's kind of where it gets tough. It gets really tough. I remember that I went to Cuba a few years ago, and one of the lasting impressions that was made on me is when I went to Cuba, and I saw how the people lived, and the poverty that they were experiencing, caused largely by the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And I almost felt indignant because the people who are suffering by that embargo aren't the government officials per se. It's the local people who are innocent. And so I was kind of just filled with indignation about the U.S. position towards Cuba. And in my mind, I was questioning, well, what did it really accomplish? And the U.S. applies pressure like this to countries in hopes that the government will fold. But communism has been there in Cuba since the 1960s. It's still there. So I think we could say that the U.S. embargo on Cuba has not been effective in toppling communism in Cuba. But then at the same time, I started thinking about it. Wait a minute, was communism the real motive for this embargo? Isn't there another communist country that the U.S. is buddies with, a country called China, and they're communist, but there's no embargo there. And I know there's current discussions about the trade war with China at the moment. But for all these years, we've worked with China, a communist country, but yet we put an embargo on Cuba. Like, why the double standard? And this is I know this is a signal for money here. That's the reason why. Because there's a financial gain in China. There's probably not much of a financial gain in Cuba. So yeah, I have mixed feelings about it, and I don't even want to get right now into what the book of Revelation says about the end of time and about Babylon and about the merchants of the earth and the kings of the earth who have made themselves rich and wealthy with excessive luxury through unjust means. I don't want to kind of go that route, but I have mixed feelings about it. I really do. I have mixed feelings about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. But anyways, all right, let's move on. Then the podcast, it says that Americans live in a bubble. And I think that may be true to a certain extent. I think the world is the world is getting smaller. But I remember I lived in a bubble for many years, and that's how I was, I have Hispanic parents. But I remember the first time I left the United States of America and went to a Latin American country. And in my mind, I thought the rest of the world was like the United States of America. And then when I went to Latin America for the very first time, and I looked around and I saw just the level of poverty and how people lived, I was like, oh wow, not every place is like the U.S. And so I think that's a positive thing, though, to be able to see how other people live. The guest speaker, Fabian Carballo, he encourages people to go on mission trips to other countries, just to see how they live and to just get a different perspective about life. All right, moving on from that point, I thought it was insightful where he clarified the refugee laws. For example, he says that we've done this in the past with Cubans. If Cubans are able to set foot on American soil, we give them refugee status, so we give them asylum. I think it's almost, I think we even give them residency. I'm not sure exactly, but yeah, it's a refugee law. That the refugee law, if you're able to set foot on American soil, you are protected. And he says we've done this for Cubans in the past. We've done it for Nicaraguans in the past during the 1980s when communism was trying to get into Nicaragua. Same with the Salvadorians, gave them protected status during the 1980s. We did it for the Vietnamese, we did it for the Koreans, and we did it, I think, for any communist who found themselves somehow traveling to the United States. If they wanted to apply for refugee status, they could, and we would take them in and we would welcome them in. And so he says, why are we changing our tone now? It's a practice that we've always had in the past. Why are we changing our tone now with regards to refugees coming from Latin America? And I think one of the challenges is when there are a lot of individuals that are coming. You hear about the stories of the caravans and thousands of people in those caravans coming and wanting to enter the United States of America. And it's a challenge, and I think that's probably more of what the challenge is the quantity of people at any given time wanting to come in. Creates a challenge, but and then he says, who are these people who are coming into the United States in caravans or wanting to come into the United States from Latin America, from Central America, primarily from the countries of Honduras, which is where my mother's from. So I kind of have a personal, not that it's personal for me, but I'm a little bit better acquainted with the situation in Honduras than in other places. But he says, who are these people who are wanting to come into the United States? And he says, well, they're people who are trying to escape violence and kidnapping, etc. And here's a little anecdotal story from a friend of mine. And this is a real hard situation. Definitely life isn't easy in Latin America. But I have a friend who works with the Department of Homeland Security. He's an adjudicator, and he interviews individuals who have been caught by Border Patrol. And these individuals who are caught by Border Patrol, and they say, I'm here looking for asylum, I'm here as a refugee. And so when they say that, then they have to go through a process of adjudication to find out whether it's true or not, whether these individuals are truly coming from a bad situation, that they need to escape, that their life is being threatened. And so a friend of mine who works there with the Department of Homeland Security, and this is purely anecdotal, he told me, and he's also Hispanic, so I think he's sympathetic with the situation, but at the same time he has a job to do. And he tells me, he says, Jonathan, we sit down and we interview people all day long, and he says every single one of them is telling the same exact story. Every single one of them is telling the same exact story. In other words, they know what story to tell. They are aware about the laws of refugees and asylum, and to a certain extent, it seems that they're taking advantage of the laws for their own benefit. And I know it's hard. It's a hard situation. It really is. All right, let's move on from that. Another situation that the guest speaker on that podcast mentions is sweatshops in Latin America, and he says, look at where your clothes is made, and look at the tags and these kinds of things. And I don't know if he necessarily mentions them as sweatshops in Latin America, but that's kind of, I think, where he was probably going. And being from Honduras, and I've seen the factories that they have. My brother-in-law was telling me about the factories that they have in Nicaragua, and I think Colombia has Colombia Sportswear. They have factories there in Nicaragua. And so, yes, the truth is that they don't get paid U.S. wages in Latin America for the work that they do, but these individuals do get paid fair wages, and it provides jobs for them. So to say, well, I'm not going to purchase your clothes anymore because it's made in Latin America. I want to buy U.S. only goods. We're actually, if we have a heart for Latin America or for countries outside the United States, making sure that they also can have fair wages and things like that, we're actually doing them a harm because we're taking jobs away from them by saying, no, I don't want to buy your clothes anymore. He mentions child labor laws in Latin America. I don't know if this is still the case in Honduras or not, but I remember that for many years the teachers were on strike in Honduras, and so they would only teach half a day, and then after that the kids had nothing else to do because there wasn't any school. And so I think it's a positive thing if a child wants to work in one of these factories after school. It provides income for them, very needed income. He also, I think, mentioned this phrase, they are slaves in Latin America so that we can have inexpensive clothes and products and we can consume things. He says we are exploiting the continent, and they don't have the benefits that we do here. And I don't know. I think that's a little harsh. I think that's a little harsh there. I think there's another side to it, and I think there's a positive side that these companies are indeed providing jobs for these countries and for the individuals who live in this country, and then at the same time, Americans can benefit from goods that are not as expensive as they would be if they were made here in the United States of America. Then he mentioned something about, well, why do these individuals want to leave their countries? And I think we're gonna come back to this question here pretty soon. So why do these individuals want to leave their countries? All right, we'll come back to that question here pretty soon. All right, then the individual says the U.S. is responsible to a certain extent for the economic conditions in these countries, referring to Latin America. And you know what? I think at this point, I'm just talking a lot of things about what I don't like about this podcast. I think there was a lot I did like. Maybe I'm just focusing on things I don't like because they're the things that kind of struck me here. So, but I think it's good to listen to all sides and kind of just build our own perspective. But he says the U.S. is responsible to a certain extent for the economic conditions in these countries, and this is another one that I struggle with. And I struggle with this one, putting the blame on the U.S. for the economic conditions of Latin America. I struggle with doing that because I know that there is a lot of corruption in Latin America. Now, granted, there's corruption everywhere, but it seems that certain places tend to be more corrupt than others. And so I don't know, I think that's a little harsh to say the U.S. is responsible when there is a lot of corruption in Latin America. Our own people exploiting our own people. It's not foreigners exploiting us, it's we're exploiting ourselves. I hear stories of how the U.S. Plundered the natural resources of Latin America, and they probably did. They probably did. But then I ask myself the question, well, who let the U.S. do that? And the answer, it was local Latin American corrupt leadership, corrupt government who padded their own pockets, their own personal pockets. They didn't care about the people that they were called to serve and to protect. And so I don't know that I would lay the blame for the economic woes of Latin America on the U.S. I think it's probably more appropriate for Latin America to own it, instead of trying to blame someone else. And then here, this gets a little tricky because I don't know if it's a cultural thing. When I mean cultural thing, corruption, I don't know if that's more of a cultural thing down there in Latin America. The individual will reference a few of the European countries. He mentions Austria, and he mentions he kind of has traveled through Europe. And he mentioned that European countries have created an economic system where there is no need to immigrate to another country. And so as he said that, knowing that my wife is from Lithuania, and I'm also kind of familiar with the situation in Europe. So he says, okay, Europeans have created a situation where it's a positive economic situation that they've created. And then so my question is, well, why haven't Latin Americans done the same thing for their country? And I'm telling you, there's something, I'm coming back to the cultural thing, there's something about Europeans, especially Northern Europeans. There's just something about that. It seems that Northern Europeans, especially, they know how to make prosperous societies. Is it something, again, about their culture? Is it their mindset? Whereas it seems in Latin America, not so much. I don't know what it is. Is it the weather of the Northern European climates? In fact, when you look across the globe, and I have a little globe here that I keep in my office, and as you look around the globe, the most prosperous countries in the world tend to be in the Northern Hemisphere. I don't know if it's something about the cold weather that makes them a little bit more industrious, but I mean, even across Asia, the Northern Asian countries tend to be more prosperous than the Southern Asian countries. The Northern Europeans, England, Germany, France, they tend to be a little bit more prosperous than the Southern European countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, and some of these other countries. So I don't know if it's a cultural thing. I don't know what that's all about. But, again, Northern Europeans have made their countries prosperous. Well, why can't Latin Americans do that? What's the difference there? Then he goes on and he mentions borders, that there's open borders in Europe. And then he says that there's no tension in other countries about immigrants, about other European immigrants coming and going in European countries. So again, because my wife is from Europe and I know a little bit about it, it's not, I don't think it's that easy. When, for example, let me take Lithuania. When Lithuania became part of the European Union, and all of a sudden their borders were now open to the rest of the European Union nations, when that happened, there was a mass exodus, a mass immigration out of Lithuania and into other fellow European Union countries such as the United Kingdom, Germany, now Norway. In fact, the population of Lithuania, I think when it was communist, I think it was about 6 million or so. I could be wrong. And I think the population of Lithuania has now dwindled to like 3 or 2 million. I don't know. It depends what sources you look at. So that is a big drop off of people leaving the country. And they're leaving the country because they're looking for more opportunities. And they're specifically targeting the most prosperous countries of the European Union, such as England, Norway, Germany. I don't know that there's so many in France or so, but they're looking for to move into the most wealthy countries of the EU. And there is a little bit of tension because of that in these countries. They're look, even though they're all Europeans, they kind of look at Lithuanians and they're like, what are all these Lithuanians doing here? So it's not as simple as, open borders and Europeans, everything's great and they welcome everybody. That's not necessarily the situation there. And then Lithuania is also suffering now because a lot of the young people have immigrated out of the country. There's not a workforce anymore, or the workforce is aging in Lithuania. And the best, the most industrious, the cream of the crop has kind of left Lithuania to other countries. And so it kind of created a little bit of a crisis there. So that was just kind of my comments when I heard about that, about open borders. Let's take a little bit of time to think about borders in the United States of America. because I don't know if the speaker was getting to that the U.S. should have open borders or not. I don't think he said that. That it's kind of what it sounded like. I'm not in favor of open borders, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about what the Bible has to say about borders and boundaries. And so, probably one of the first stories we have in the Bible is of the Tower of Babel and the dividing of the nations. And that's something that God did. He confused the languages, and then it lists where the different people groups went to. And I think the idea is that Japheth, these are the sons of Noah, Japheth and his descendants, they moved into Europe. Shem and his descendants stayed around the Middle East and maybe pushed out east into Asia. And then Ham and his descendants kind of moved into Africa, and everyone kind of moved in their own direction. And so that's the first story that you have in the Bible about borders. Here's another Bible verse. How about this one? Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8. It says, when the Most High assigned lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to their number, or according to their population. So here in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8, you have this notion of God establishing the nations, assigning them their lands, dividing them up, and establishing boundaries according to their population. When you see how God gave the Israelites the land of Canaan, and he divided up the land of Canaan into 12 different parts for the 12 different tribes of Israel, he divided them. He said, Judah, this is your land, and these are your borders. And he actually, in the Bible, it clearly defines, your land is up to this point and up to that geographical point. Then after that, Benjamin, this is your area. And he also did it based on their population sizes. There's more of you, so you guys get more land. There's less of you, so you guys get less land. And on a smaller scale, when we talk about boundaries and borders, on a smaller scale, when we're thinking about families, I think borders and boundaries are healthy things for families. I think it's a good thing for families to have their own space. I don't think it's healthy when families lose their boundaries and for lack of a better word, are up in each other's business. I think there's a place for healthy boundaries. And in fact, there's a book called Boundaries. And so I think and actually it's a book about relationships, how to have healthy relationships. And so I think boundaries are good. And what we're talking about here is we're talking about the application of boundaries on national levels. And I also think that that's a healthy thing. Here's another one, another Bible example of boundaries. There's Nehemiah. He was tasked with the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. And he was doing that. One of the primary reasons was for protection. And okay, should I talk about? No, all right, we're gonna go there in a little bit. Acts chapter 17 and verse 26, the Bible says, from one man God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and God marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. So here again, it looks like boundaries are a good thing, and it's what the Bible. Just a few Bible verses here that boundaries are a good thing. Man, do I want to talk about Israel and the wall in Israel and the Palestinians? You know what, I will, just because I already mentioned it. Man, this one is really tough here. When I went to Israel a few years ago, and you go into Israel and then you see the wall that they have built that separates Israel from the West Bank. When I saw that wall, and then you see the guard towers, and you see how high that wall is, and basically the whole West Bank is surrounded by this wall. I don't even know how tall it is. You get I got really bad feelings about that wall. I started thinking Germany. I started thinking about the Berlin Wall. I got really, really bad vibes about it. And then as we're talking to the tour guide, who himself is Israeli, he's explaining to us about the wall. We went into the West Bank. We went to see Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is inside the West Bank, where the Palestinians are. And boy, is it a contrast, like night and day. to see what Israel looks like. Israel's like a first world country. You go to Israel, it looks like you're in the U.S. I mean, it doesn't miss a beat. It is quite impressive what the Israelis have done with their nation. These last, what is it? They go in there in the 60s. I don't remember exactly. So these last 50 years or so, it's incredible how they built a nation up from nothing. So you go from the Israeli side, and then you go into the Palestinian side, and you just see the level of poverty. And not just poverty, but it's not very clean, and so I want to be very sensitive here, but it is a sharp contrast. I mean, there's trash in the streets everywhere. I know this is really tough, and so the Israeli tour guide, he said, if we didn't have this wall, Israel would look just like that. And people could say, well, the reason it looks like that is because, the Israelis have done that to them, have closed them in like that. It's tough. And then he says, we don't have a problem with the Palestinians. It's the Palestinians who attack us and who put bombs over here. Granted, the Israelis retaliate, and I don't know that that's necessarily a healthy thing. And so he says, we built this wall so that there won't be any bombs, so that Palestinians won't come and won't, blow things up. It's really hard. I don't think it's easy. I don't think there's any easy answers. I think it's a shame. So anyways, coming back to borders, coming back to walls, my personal opinion, if the U.S. wants to build a border wall, which they do have in certain places, if the U.S. wants to build a border wall, I'm not opposed to it. I think there's other issues, though, that need to be addressed as well, such as our need for cheap immigrant labor. And with that note, let's move on to what they talked about, that these immigrants are the fear that these immigrants are going to take our jobs. And then the podcast says that the truth is that Americans, we don't want to do the jobs that immigrants do. He mentions that the work that they do is honorable, but it's menial work. They are involved in farming, they're involved in custodial work, they're involved in construction work and back-breaking types of work. I remember listening to an interview of a farm owner here in Florida several years ago, and I think the farm owner was a white Caucasian, and he was saying, if we try to get rid of our undocumented workers or the illegal immigrants, if we want to have a crackdown on illegal immigration, he's like, there's not going to be anybody to work the farm. There's not going to be anybody to harvest, anybody to plant, anybody to work the farm. And he says, in fact, it's kind of true. There was, I think, a situation that happened in Manassas, Virginia, where they had a crackdown on illegal immigrants. And then the following day, once all the illegal immigrants were gone, restaurant owners come in and their dishwasher guy's gone, and the person doing the cooking's gone, and the construction guy, their people are gone, and they can't finish the work. And so I think the people of Manassas, Virginia, quickly realized, oh, wait a minute, we need these people. We made a mistake. So this farmer here in Florida, he says if we crack down on illegal immigrants, we're not going to have any workers to work on the farm. And then he says, we could have white people come and work on the farm. We could have black people come and work on the farm. I guess by what he means by that, we can have American citizens come and work on the farm. But they want to be paid more than minimum wage to do this job. And he's like, sure, we can pay them more than minimum wage, but then we're going to have to raise the prices of the produce. And I don't think the customer or the consumer will want that. And he says, not only that, but we've had white people come and work, and we've had black people come in and work. And he says they just don't work as hard as the Hispanic immigrants work. They take breaks and they just want to work an 8-hour day. And of course, I don't know, also this probably gets into issues of labor laws as well. But he says these Hispanic immigrant workers, they come and they work from morning, they work at night, they don't take breaks. They're content with minimum wage. Minimum wage is much more than they would be earning in their countries as well. These people are hard workers. They get down, they hunker down, and they just work all day long. And so I thought that was an interesting perspective, about that when we say, well, they're going to take our jobs. Well, do we really want their jobs? I'm not so sure that we do. Something else interesting that said in the podcast, that immigrants raise the standard of living for everyone. I thought that was interesting, how he kind of phrased that. He also mentioned that immigrants do pay taxes. And he says, you can escape. I thought that was clever. He said you can escape from INS, but nobody can escape from the IRS. And sure enough, these illegal immigrants or undocumented individuals who are here, they do pay taxes, they pay Social Security, they pay into the Social Security fund, but none of them will ever receive any of those funds because they're not documented here, they're not legal here, and so they're putting in. And the story was that they're putting in millions, if not billions, of money into the Social Security fund that they'll never tap that money. And the question is, well, is that fair? Is it unfair for them to do that, or is that simply the price that they pay for being here illegally? Is it fair that they pay into Social Security but they'll never be able to take out from it? Is it fair? Is it not fair? Is that the price they pay for being here illegally? I don't know. Then he talks about criminal behavior and being in this country illegally as a violation of the law. And as Christians, we need to obey the laws of the land. And then he says, people would think differently about that if they understood how immigration law is different from, say, criminal law or civil law, if there's even a distinction there. And I'm not a lawyer, so then some of this is legalese. But he says, as Christians, we say we need to obey the laws of the land, and yet we have Hispanic Christians who are here illegally in this country. Are they in violation of the law? And it reminds me of a church in Kentucky. And I remember it was a Spanish church, and I don't know, there's probably 100 or 200 members in that Spanish church. And from what the pastor told me, there was only 2 members in that entire congregation of 200 and more. There was only 2 members, Hispanic members, who were there legally, the pastor and then another gentleman, another elder of that church. And he says everyone else here has fake Social Security numbers. Everyone else here has a fake name that they use at work. They have a fake driver's license with a fake name, with a fake Social Security number. And I remember the pastor said, how can we expect God to bless this church when everyone is living a lie? And yet on the other side of it, if not for immigration into the United States of America, the Christian church would actually be in decline. But because of the immigration, mainly from Latin America, the Christian church is increasing. Christianity is increasing here in North America. So that's a real tricky thing. And so the individual on the podcast, he says, well, immigration law is not like criminal behavior. It's more like maybe breaking the speed limit. And which of us have not broken the speed limit? I think if we be honest, probably the majority of us break the speed limit all the time. Does that make us criminals? He also mentioned, likened it to maybe evading taxes. I guess it's a criminal offense. Anyways. But he says it's different. It's not like these people who are here illegally. It's not like they're killing other people or committing crimes. Their crime is that they're here illegally. And what he mentioned about that, or they're here undocumented, he mentioned his own example that, one day his father they were here in the country legally, and then the next day their time ran up, and then they were here illegally. So you're legal one day and you're illegal the next day, and it's kind of a weird thing. I thought it was interesting that the podcast individual called us, I think, to defy immigration laws. I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but it kind of seemed like he was kind of going that direction. He likened immigration laws to unjust laws. He mentioned them to the laws of segregation that there used to be in the 1960s. I don't know if they're quite the same thing. I don't know that I would make that comparison. But here's just another example of how tricky immigration laws are. So I know an individual who was in this country for over 30 years. The majority of their adult life, they were here in the United States of America illegally. And for a while, they could maneuver. But then within the last few years, things got really tight. For example, they couldn't renew their driver's license. That created all kinds of problems for job and for transportation and things like that. I don't even know if there were some issues with banking as well. And so they had lived the majority of their adult life here, but things were getting so tough, so tight, that the individual decided and said, well, it's probably just best for me to go back to my country. And so voluntarily, they moved back to their country in Latin America. And when you've lived the majority of your adult life in the United States of America, it's kind of hard to just pick up and then start over again in another country, even if it's your own country, but you've spent the majority of your life here. And so that individual is now struggling. Since then, I believe it was President Obama that passed some type of, I don't know if it was amnesty for those types of individuals. I don't remember exactly the situation is. So if you can imagine, if that individual would have continued to stay here in this country illegally for 2 more years or so, then they would have received amnesty to now stay here legally and get, and fix their status. But instead, the individual went back to their country. Now they're stuck in their country and they're frustrated in their country. So that's kind of how immigration laws work, and it's kind of weird. It's kind of hard. So anyways, it's really tough. What steps should Christians take? He encourages you to watch what you consume or what things you buy. I'm not so sure I'm convinced about that one there. He says maybe we should educate ourselves more on immigration. He says he holds immigration seminars, which I think is kind of a cool thing. I also think it was kind of a cool thing where he says to take in immigrant families and to help them and adopt them and help them to integrate to life here in the United States of America. And man, he told a story of when he was a kid and they had just immigrated here to the U.S. and people would throw toys away, and his dad had a paper route, and they would go picking through the garbage, perfectly good toys that he would take for himself. And anyways, what an incredible story. And finally, he talked about the issue of xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of others, where we're just afraid of people who don't look like us, people who don't speak like us, people who dress different to us. They come from a different place from us. Actually, now on the line of xenophobia versus homogeneity, I think it's okay. I think we naturally hang out around people who look like us, who talk like us, who have a similar experience than us. Not that I want to generalize, but if you notice, white people hang around white people, black people hang around black people, Hispanic people hang around Hispanic people, Asians hang around Asians. Nothing wrong with that. It's nothing wrong with that. But then on the flip side of that, though, is xenophobia, where you're afraid of other people who don't look like us, or who don't think like us, or who have a different culture from us. And I definitely think that that's a bad thing. I don't think we should be afraid of people who are different from us. In fact, I think we should get to know people who aren't like us. I think we should learn from them. One of the things I love about Adventist universities is how diverse Seventh-day Adventist college campuses are. For example, Andrews University is one of the most diverse college campuses in the United States of America, and I think that's a great thing. I think we can learn from every culture. You can learn from white culture, you can learn from black culture, and you can learn from Hispanic culture, and you can learn from Asian culture and African culture and Middle Eastern culture and European culture, and I hope I haven't left out any cultures. From the Pacific cultures, you can learn from them, from the islands. And I think that as we embrace other cultures and we learn from other cultures and we talk to other cultures, I think that we become better people because of it. All right. And the Bible does say that on the Sea of Glass, there are people who are redeemed from every nation, kindred, tribe, and people. So yes, while we feel comfortable around people who look like us, I think there's also a call to embrace people who don't look like us and to welcome them. And as the Bible says, to love the foreigner, to treat them as a native born. I think that's a good thing, and I think we'll be better people because of it. Okay, well, this wraps up this podcast, and our next podcast will be about abortion, and I'm going to put again the link for that podcast in the description below. What does the Bible say about abortion? Okay, well, God bless, and we'll catch you next time.